Picture a ritual taking place thousands of years ago. A fire burns in the darkness. A handful of dried leaves is placed into the embers, and a dense cloud of fragrant smoke rises into the night. People gather around it. The smoke isn't just filling the air anymore, it's becoming part of something deliberate. But here's the strange part. Nobody knows who discovered smoking. There is no ancient inventor we can name, no preserved instruction manual explaining how to inhale a burning plant, and no single archaeological site that can be confidently called the birthplace of smoking. What we do have is a trail of clues: ancient pipes, charred botanical remains, chemical traces, paintings, written accounts, and traditions that survived long after the people who created them disappeared. And those clues reveal something fascinating. Smoking was not invented once. It emerged in different forms as humans learned to experiment with plants, fire, ritual, and altered states of consciousness. And the story takes us from prehistoric landscapes to ancient China, across the Americas into Africa, and eventually into Europe, where one unfamiliar plant would transform the world. Before tobacco, humans were experimenting with smoke. The history of smoking begins with a distinction that's easy to miss. Smoking and tobacco are not the same story. Humans encountered smoke for hundreds of thousands of years before tobacco ever entered the picture. Once people learned to control fire, they were surrounded by opportunities to experiment. Different plants produced different smells and burning characteristics, and prehistoric communities already possessed sophisticated knowledge about which plants were edible, poisonous, medicinal, or useful. Some of this experimentation almost certainly involved burning plants for purposes other than inhalation. Smoke can repel insects, alter the smell of a space, and accompany food preparation. Aromatic plants can create powerful sensory experiences when burned. In a world without synthetic perfumes, chemical repellents, or manufactured medicines, a burning plant could be surprisingly useful. But eventually, humans discovered another possibility. The smoke itself could be deliberately drawn into the body. Exactly how that transition happened is impossible to reconstruct. Archaeology rarely preserves behavior itself. A person inhaling smoke leaves behind almost nothing. What survives are the objects and residues surrounding the practice, and those clues become particularly interesting when we move into ancient Asia. One of the oldest substances associated with deliberate smoke inhalation was not tobacco at all, but cannabis. Archaeological evidence from Central and East Asia suggests that cannabis was being used in ancient societies thousands of years ago, and researchers have found evidence indicating that its psychoactive properties were known surprisingly early. At sites associated with ancient Central Asian cultures, archaeologists have recovered wooden braziers and cannabis residue, suggesting that plants may have been burned specifically for their smoke. This changes the picture. The earliest history of smoking wasn't simply a story about somebody discovering tobacco. Humans were experimenting with a whole range of plants long before tobacco became globally important. And sometimes those experiments were connected to something deeper than curiosity. They were connected to ritual. When smoke became a bridge to the invisible. For ancient societies, smoke had an unusual quality. A solid plant could be placed into fire and suddenly disappear into something that floated upward. It moved with the wind, changed shape constantly, and vanished into the sky. That physical transformation made smoke an obvious symbol in religious and ceremonial practices. In ancient Central Asia, for example, evidence suggests that cannabis may have been burned in ritual contexts. Some researchers have connected this with funerary ceremonies, where psychoactive smoke may have helped participants enter altered states or communicate symbolically with the supernatural. But this wasn't unique to Central Asia. Across human cultures, aromatic smoke repeatedly appears in rituals. Incense became important in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, South Asia, China, and later the Mediterranean world. Not all incense was smoked by inhaling it. Often the smoke itself was the ritual object. But the underlying idea was similar. Plants could be transformed by fire into something that occupied the space between the physical and spiritual worlds. This matters because it gives us a possible pathway toward deliberate smoking. People already knew that burning plants could change the atmosphere around them. They knew certain plants produced powerful smells. They knew some substances could alter perception when consumed. The next step was to control how that smoke entered the body, and humans became remarkably creative. They developed pipes and other devices capable of directing smoke. Some were made from wood, others from clay or stone. In different parts of the world, these technologies appeared in different forms. But nowhere was this relationship between plants, smoke, and ritual more important than in the Americas, because that's where tobacco enters the story. The plant that changed everything. Long before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, tobacco was already deeply embedded in indigenous cultures across the Americas, and it wasn't simply something people smoked for entertainment. Tobacco could carry religious, political, medicinal, and social meanings depending on the culture using it. In parts of the Caribbean, indigenous peoples used tobacco in ceremonies, and European observers later recorded seeing people inhale tobacco smoke through simple devices. One of the most important early European accounts comes from the voyages associated with Christopher Columbus. When Columbus and his crew encountered indigenous communities in the Caribbean in the late 15th century, they encountered unfamiliar plants and unfamiliar smoking practices. European observers described people carrying burning bundles or using devices to inhale tobacco smoke. The Europeans were fascinated. They had encountered something they had never seen before, and they took tobacco back across the Atlantic. That moment changed history. Within decades, tobacco had moved from an indigenous American tradition into European society. Europeans began cultivating it, trading it, experimenting with it, and consuming it in increasingly diverse ways. But there was a cultural misunderstanding at the center of this encounter. Indigenous societies had developed specific traditions around tobacco. Europeans increasingly separated the plant from those original cultural contexts and transformed it into a commodity. The plant was no longer simply part of a ritual or community tradition. It was becoming something that could be bought and sold, and that was the beginning of tobacco's global expansion. Smoking escapes. The ritual. Once tobacco crossed the Atlantic, European societies experimented with it in multiple forms. Some people smoked it through pipes, others used cigars. Snuff, finely ground tobacco inhaled through the nose, became fashionable among European elites. In the 16th and 17th centuries, tobacco gradually moved through European courts, ports, military camps, and commercial networks. One particularly famous figure helped give tobacco an early European identity, Jean Nicot, a French diplomat who promoted tobacco at the French court. His name would eventually become attached to the chemical compound nicotine. But tobacco's journey wasn't simply a story of popularity. It also became a story of economics. European powers established plantations and expanded cultivation, particularly in their American colonies. Tobacco required land, labor, transportation, and international trade. As demand increased, tobacco became tied to colonial economies and, tragically, to systems of forced and enslaved labor. This is one of the points where the history of smoking becomes much larger than smoking itself. A plant that indigenous Americans had used within cultural traditions became part of a global economic system, and the technology around it kept changing. Early smokers used pipes and cigars. Eventually, people began rolling shredded tobacco into paper. The cigarette was born from this wider evolution, but the truly dramatic transformation came later. Industrialization turned smoking from a craft and tradition into mass production. The machine that changed the habit. For most of human history, preparing tobacco was relatively slow. Someone had to grow it, dry it, process it, and prepare it for use. Then machines changed the equation. In the 19th century, cigarette-making technology allowed factories to produce enormous quantities of cigarettes quickly and cheaply. That created something ancient societies had never experienced, a standardized smoking product available to millions of people. Mass production was followed by mass marketing. Tobacco companies didn't simply sell tobacco. They sold identities. Smoking could be presented as sophisticated, rebellious, masculine, feminine, modern, relaxing, or glamorous, depending on the audience. Advertising turned a traditional practice into a carefully engineered consumer habit. And as transportation improved, tobacco products could travel almost anywhere. The scale was unprecedented. A behavior that had once been practiced within particular communities could now spread across continents through commerce. But there was a serious problem. The human body was paying a price that ancient societies couldn't have understood. Modern research eventually established that tobacco smoke contains numerous toxic and carcinogenic substances, and that smoking dramatically increases the risk of diseases including lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, and chronic respiratory illness. Nicotine also makes tobacco highly addictive. That doesn't mean ancient people were simply unaware of everything. They observed immediate effects. They developed cultural explanations for them. but the microscopic mechanisms and long-term consequences required centuries of scientific investigation to understand. And by the time modern medicine fully revealed the danger, tobacco had already become deeply embedded in global society. So who really invented smoking? The answer is surprisingly uncomfortable. Nobody. At least nobody we can identify. Smoking probably wasn't invented like a machine. It was more like a cultural evolution. Humans learned to control fire. They experimented with plants. They discovered that burning different materials produced different kinds of smoke. Some plants became important for ritual or practical purposes. Certain societies developed methods of deliberately inhaling smoke. Other cultures developed their own traditions independently. Cannabis appears in ancient Central Asian evidence. Incense became part of ritual traditions across multiple civilizations. Tobacco became deeply embedded in indigenous American cultures. European exploration then carried tobacco across the Atlantic. Global trade spread it further. Industrialization transformed it into mass-produced cigarettes. And modern advertising turned those cigarettes into a global consumer product. That's a very different story from the idea that one ancient human simply invented smoking. The deeper story is about cumulative human experimentation. One generation discovers something, the next generation modifies it. Another gives it a ritual meaning. Another turns it into a trade good. And centuries later, technology transforms the entire practice. That pattern appears again and again in human history. The modern world is filled with objects whose origins were never single inventions. They were accumulated discoveries. Smoking is one of them. So, how did ancient humans start smoking? We can't point to one person or one moment, but we can follow the trail. It begins with humans mastering fire and becoming increasingly knowledgeable about plants. It continues with ancient societies experimenting with aromatic and psychoactive plants, sometimes burning them in ritual contexts. It develops into sophisticated traditions involving substances such as cannabis and tobacco. Then tobacco crosses the Atlantic and enters European trade networks. And eventually, industrial machines transform an ancient practice into a product manufactured on a massive scale. The cigarette may look modern, but the relationship between humans and smoke is ancient. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Our ancestors didn't inherit a manual explaining how the natural world worked. They learned through observation. They experimented. They remembered. They taught. Sometimes the result was medicine, sometimes technology, sometimes ritual, and sometimes a habit that would eventually reshape economies, cultures, and public health around the world. The first smoker probably never imagined any of that. They couldn't have known that thousands of years later, humans would understand molecules, nicotine, addiction, and the chemistry of smoke. They simply encountered a strange property of the natural world and found a way to make it part of human culture. That is the deeper story behind smoking, not the story of a cigarette, the story of curiosity becoming tradition, tradition becoming trade, and trade becoming industry. And perhaps that's one of the most revealing patterns in human history. We don't just discover nature, we turn what we discover into culture. If you enjoyed uncovering this forgotten chapter of human history, subscribe to Tales of Sapiens, because every ordinary thing around us has an extraordinary story hidden in the past. See you in the next tale.